2. And you are pleased with Paris, monsieur? Astang? Demanded Madame Marotte the next morning, as Hastings came into the breakfast room of the pension, rosy from his plunge in the limited bath above. I am sure I shall like it, he replied, wondering at his own depression of spirits. The maid brought him coffee and rolls. He returned the vacant glance of the big-headed young man, and acknowledged diffidently the salutes of the snuffy old gentleman. He did not try to finish his coffee, and sat crumbling a roll, unconscious of the sympathetic glances of Madame Marotte, who had tact enough not to bother him. Presently a maid entered with a tray on which was balanced 2 bowls of chocolate, and the snuffy old gentleman leered at her ankles. The maid deposited the chocolate at a table near the window and smiled at Hastings. Then a thin young lady, followed by her counterpart in all except years, marched into the room and took the table near the window. They were evidently American, but Hastings, if he expected any sign of recognition, was disappointed. To be ignored by compatriots intensified his depression. He fumbled with his knife and looked at his plate. The thin young lady was talkative enough. She was quite aware of Hastings' presence, ready to be flattered if he looked at her. But, on the other hand, she felt her superiority, for she had been 3 weeks in Paris, and he, it was easy to see, had not yet unpacked his steamer trunk. Her conversation was complacent. She argued with her mother upon the relative merits of the Louvre and the Bon Marché, but her mother's part of the discussion was mostly confined to the observation, "Why, Susie?" The snuffy old gentleman had left the room in a body, outwardly polite and inwardly raging. They could not endure the Americans who filled the room with their chatter. The big-headed young man looked after them with a knowing cough, murmuring, "Gay old birds." "They look like bad old men, Mr. Bladen," said the girl. To this Mr. Bladen smiled and said, "They've had their day," in a tone which implied that he was now having his. "And that's why they all have baggy eyes," cried the girl. "I think it's a shame for young gentlemen." "Why, Susie?" said the mother, and the conversation lagged. After a while, Mr. Bladen threw down the Petit Journal, which he daily studied at the expense of the house, and turning to Hastings started to make himself agreeable. He began by saying, "I see you are an American." To this brilliant and original opening, Hastings, deadly homesick, replied gratefully, and the conversation was judiciously nourished by observations from Miss Susie Byng distinctly addressed to Mr. Bladen. In the course of events, Miss Susie, forgetting to address herself exclusively to Mr. Bladen, and Hastings replying to her general question, the entente cordiale was established, and Susie and her mother extended a protectorate over what was clearly neutral territory. "Mr. Hastings, you must not desert the pension every evening as Mr. Bladen does. Paris is an awful place for young gentlemen, and Mr. Bladen is a horrid cynic." Mr. Bladen looked gratified. Hastings answered, "I shall be at the studio all day, and I imagine I shall be glad enough to come back at night." Mr. Bladen, who at a salary of $15 a week acted as agent for the Pewley Manufacturing Company of Troy, NY, smiled a skeptical smile and withdrew to keep an appointment with a customer on the Boulevard Magenta. Hastings walked into the garden with Mrs. Byng and Susie, and, at their invitation, sat down in the shade before the iron gate. The chestnut trees still bore their fragrant spikes of pink and white, and the bees hummed among the roses trellised on the white-walled house. A faint freshness was in the air. The watering carts moved up and down the street, and a clear stream bubbled over the spotless gutters of the Rue de la Grande Chaumière. The sparrows were merry along the curbstones, taking bath after bath in the water and ruffling their feathers with delight. In a walled garden across the street, a pair of blackbirds whistled among the almond trees. Hastings swallowed the lump in his throat, for the song of the birds and the ripple of water in a Paris gutter brought back to him the sunny meadows of Millbrook. "That's a blackbird," observed Miss Byng. "See him there on the bush with pink blossoms. He's all black, except his bill, and that looks as if it had been dipped in an omelette, as some Frenchman says." "Why, Susie," said Mrs. Byng. "That garden belongs to a studio inhabited by 2 Americans," continued the girl serenely, "and I often see them pass. They seem to need a great many models, mostly young and feminine." "Why, Susie?" "Perhaps they prefer painting that kind, but I don't see why they should invite 5, with 3 more young gentlemen, and all get into 2 cabs and drive away singing. This street," she continued, "is dull. There is nothing to see except the garden and a glimpse of the boulevard Montparnasse through the Rue de la Grande Chaumière. No one ever passes except a policeman. There is a convent on the corner." "I thought it was a Jesuit college," began Hastings, but was at once overwhelmed with a Baedeker description of the place, ending with, "On one side stand the palatial hotels of Jean-Paul Laurent and Guillaume Bouguereau, and opposite, in the little passage Stanislas, Carolus Duran paints the masterpieces which charm the world." The blackbird burst into a ripple of golden throaty notes, and from some distant green spot in the city, an unknown wild bird answered with a frenzy of liquid trills until the sparrows paused in their ablutions to look up with restless chirps. Then a butterfly came and sat on a cluster of heliotrope and waved his crimson banded wings in the hot sunshine. Hastings knew him for a friend, and before his eyes there came a vision of tall mulleins and scented milkweed alive with painted wings, a vision of a white house and woodbine-covered piazza, a glimpse of a man reading and a woman leaning over the pansy bed, and his heart was full. He was startled a moment later by Miss Byng. "I believe you are homesick," Hastings blushed. Miss Byng looked at him with a sympathetic sigh and continued, "Whenever I felt homesick at first, I used to go with Mamma and walk in the Luxembourg Gardens. I don't know why it is, but those old-fashioned gardens seem to bring me nearer home than anything in this artificial city." "But they are full of marble statues," said Mrs. Byng mildly. "I don't see the resemblance myself." "Where is the Luxembourg?" inquired Hastings after a silence. "Come with me to the gate," said Miss Byng. He rose and followed her, and she pointed out the Rue Vavin at the foot of the street. "You pass by the convent to the right," she smiled, and Hastings went.